You're in a really important meeting, the one that you wanted to feel sharp for. And right at the moment that it's your turn to say something, something goes wrong. Your mind goes blank. The point you had clearly in your head just a second ago isn't there. You hear yourself saying something much kind of vaguer and smaller than what you really meant. And then you sit back down knowing that you had way more to give than that. Or it goes the other way. You're not blank, you're buzzing. Your heart rate is going, thoughts are racing way too fast to land any of them. Words coming out quicker than you can kind of steer them. You're so wound up that all that energy ends up working against you instead of for you. Two completely different experiences, freezing and being too wired to think. And this might surprise you. They're not two different problems. They're the same dial set wrong in opposite directions. I'm Gavin Evers, and getting people into the right state to perform when it counts is most of what I've done for over 2 decades. A high stakes meeting or a presentation is exactly that. It's a performance where your brain has to do its best work in a pretty narrow window with your heart going and the pressure on. And the thing almost nobody is taught is that there's a physical state underneath that performance, one that you have far more control over than you might think. Now, this isn't about being confident as some fixed personality trait. It's about the physiological state your body is in when you walk through that door. Your brain and body run on a level of arousal, and I don't mean anything dramatic by that word. I just mean how activated or how switched on your system is at any given moment. Now, low arousal is calm, sleepy, flat. High arousal is kind of fired up, heart pounding, adrenaline going. So here's what's actually happening beneath all of that. So when your system reads a moment as high stakes, a fast branch of your nervous system, the sympathetic branch, fires within seconds and it releases adrenaline and noradrenaline. Now, noradrenaline is essentially your brain's alertness chemical, and in the right amount is exactly what sharpens you. The catch is that this system didn't really evolve for meetings. It evolved to get you ready to fight or to run. A burst of physical energy for a physical emergency, a predator being in front of you or a fight you couldn't avoid. Now, a big presentation sets off the very same response, except now there's nothing to fight, and nowhere to run. So when that activation overshoots, all that energy, it has to go somewhere, and it turns into that racing heartbeat and the scattered thoughts. The same chemistry that sharpens you in the right dose is what tips you over the edge when there's too much of it. So the relationship between that arousal and your performance isn't a straight line. It's a curve. And as your arousal rises up from low, your performance improves with it. You get more alert, you get more focused and present, but only up to a certain point. And past the top of that curve, more arousal actually starts to make things worse. And you tip into kind of feeling jittery and scattered and overwhelmed. So the performance climbs as the system wakes up. It peaks somewhere in the middle, and then it falls away again as you get too wound up. Now, if you kind of picture an upside down U, the bottom left is the frozen flat version of you. The bottom right is the kind of wired racing version of you. And at the very top, the part that everyone wants is a state where you're alert and sharp and present without being overwhelmed. Now, that's the zone, Both of those bad meetings are just you kind of sitting at the wrong end of that same curve. This is also why the answer here is very different from the other kind of work that I often talk about. For deep focused thinking at your desk, you want to be calm and steady, a bit lower down that curve, but a presentation it's a completely different job, right? And a flat, calm state is often too low for that. You walk in underactivated and your brain simply doesn't have enough charge to fire, if that makes sense. Now that's the freeze. Same curve, but a different setting. So the goal before a high stakes moment is fairly simple, right? Get yourself to the top of that curve. If you're frozen and flat, you need to come up. And if you're wired and racing, you need to come down. Same target, but you're coming at it from different directions, depending on where you're starting from. And the fastest, most reliable way to move along that curve is with your body, not with, self-talk or, telling yourself to calm down and to fire up. That doesn't change the underlying state. Your physical state is what changes it. So take the freeze first, because I think that's the one that a lot of people understand the least. So if you tend to go blank and flat when it matters, you know, in this presentation, for example, the problem is usually that you've walked in underactivated. You know, you've probably been sitting at your desk for a few hours, your system is idling, and then you're suddenly asked to perform from a standing start. So telling yourself to focus doesn't really fix that, because the issue was never your attitude, it's your physiology. You know, you're at the bottom of the curve and you're asking a cold engine to kind of flatline, right? Now, the fix is to raise your arousal gently before you go in. You know, a few minutes of movement is fantastic, whether that's a brisk walk to the meeting instead of sitting until the last second, or a trip up and down the stairs, even just standing up, kind of rolling your shoulders back and taking a few quick, deeper breaths. That will help lift your heart rate. And you're not trying to exhaust yourself, you know, you're nudging the dial up. So when you arrive switched on rather than cold. Now, I've had clients who were convinced they were just simply bad at presenting. You know, when all that really was happening was that they were walking in flat. You know, get them moving for 5 minutes beforehand and the freeze kind of disappears. And you see this a lot in sport. Now, on the other end, the wired kind of racing too much version, here your arousal is too high. The adrenaline that was meant to sharpen you has overshot, and your thoughts won't settle, your brain's going crazy, and you sail past that top of the curve and down the other side. So the job here is the opposite one. You need to bring yourself back down, just a little. Don't want to switch off completely, but back down towards the peak. And the single most reliable tool for that is your breathing, specifically your out breath. Now, when you make your exhale longer than your inhale, you're directly switching on your parasympathetic branch, the side of your nervous system that brings everything back down. You know, you think of it as like the brake to the accelerator that fired in the first place. So you breathe in for around maybe 4 seconds and then out for 6 to 8 seconds. And just do that for a minute or two. It really, really does work. And it works quickly because you're not trying to think yourself calm. You're using your body to do it for you, right? So a slow handful of breaths in the corridor or, you know, outside the meeting room or whatever can take you from racing to steady before you've walked in. So there's a principle, right? There's a right level of activation for a high stakes performance, and it sits higher than the calm state that you'd want for deep work or deep thinking. And you reach it by moving yourself along the curve with your body. You know, you go up if you're frozen, down if you're wired. Now, the protocol for actually doing that comes down to 4 things, and none of them are particularly complicated. Now, the first is to know which way you tend to go before the day even gets near the big moment. Now, be honest with yourself about it. You know, are you a freezer or are you a racer? A lot of people know the answer immediately, and that alone tells you which direction you'll usually need to move. The second is to set yourself up in the 15 or 20 minutes beforehand. Now, if you freeze, build some movement into that window. Don't sit at your desk until the last second. Walk there, take the stairs, get your system up and out of idle and just move in a little bit. Now, if you race, build in the opposite. Find 2 minutes somewhere quiet and do that long exhale breathing that we spoke about. That will take the edge off before it starts to build up too much. The third is the final adjustment in the last 60 seconds. Now, if you're frozen and flat, stand tall, roll the shoulders back, a few faster breaths just to kind of come up a bit. If you're wired and racing, a few long, slow out breaths, that will calm you down. You're just making the last small correction to land yourself at the top of the curve before you walk in. And the fourth is the longer game. You know, the fitter and better regulated you are in general, the wider that good zone becomes, and the easier it is to stay in it when you're under pressure. Now, the regular exercise, the sleep, the nervous system work, I always kind of come back to, all of it makes you steadier when it counts. You can't out-breathe a system that's frazzled all of the time. You know, the day-to-day foundation is what makes the in-the-moment tools actually work and work properly. Now, there's something worth saying here because I think it changes how people feel about this whole thing. If you've always thought that you were just someone who isn't good in big moments, I'd gently kind of push back on that, because in over 2 decades of doing this, the people who seem naturally calm and sharp under pressure are very rarely doing nothing. You know, they've usually found a way, often without maybe naming it, to land themselves in the right state before they perform. Now, it looks like it's just their personality, but it's actually a physical habit, and a physical habit becomes something that anyone can learn. Now, the freeze isn't who you are. The nerves aren't who you are. They're a state. And the thing about a state is that it can be changed fairly easily. So let me try and bring this together for you. So performance in a high stakes moment isn't a fixed trait. It sits on a curve. And where you land on that curve is something you can steer with your own body. Freezing is too little activation, racing is too much, and the target is that alert, present state at the top. You get that by moving up if you're flat and kind of breathing down if you're too wired. Now, know which way you tend to go. Set yourself up in the minutes before, make the final adjustments in the last 60 seconds or so, and keep building the day-to-day foundation that widens the zone in the first place. So walk in at the top of that curve, and the version of you that shows up is the one you actually meant to bring. If you want a clearer picture of where your own brain performance stands right now, how you're moving, sleeping, and recovering, and how it's showing up when the pressure is on, I put together a free 3-minute assessment that looks at exactly this, and it's the best place to start, and the link is in the description below. I've also put the full routine for this one, both directions, into this week's newsletter. So how to bring yourself up if you freeze, and how to settle yourself down if you race, and when to do each one in the run-up. If that's useful to you, you'll find it there, and you can subscribe to that below. So have a great day.